Hey everybody, this is Aaron with Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'm going to be building a workbench that will be the new centerpiece of my workshop. This piece is going to be the pinnacle of functionality and will serve as my table saw outfeed table, an assembly area, tool storage, shelter, and even an art display, so stay tuned. So if you couldn't tell by now, I'm actually pretty excited about this build, and this is what the design looks like. So total surface area here is 4 by 8 with one end having a bay for the table saw, and then the rest of the main body being split into two sides, one side with drawers and the other side with these open storage areas. So I came up with this design based on watching a lot of other videos. This really took the longest time because the rabbit hole that is YouTube workbenches is endless, and I kept getting self-conscious about my design. Would I be missing out on some functionality or other potential needs, and really got stuck in that paralysis of analysis thing. But a lot of the major decisions were made based on my skill set, the room in my shop, and realistically, what am I going to be using this for, and what type of accessories am I actually going to use, because there's a million different things you can put on here. And ultimately, I have my tendencies on how I like to build things and the types of things I like to build and my skill set, so that's really what drove the decisions here. So obviously everybody has their different workshop needs and constraints, so really the goal with this video is to provide some inspiration or ideas for those looking for different ideas for their own workbench. So up to this point, all I've been doing is milling down pieces for the frame, which is going to be made out of 2x4s, and I'll have a full materials list, cost breakdown, and time to completion, and all that later in the video. So I'm not going to go into detail on the milling process here. One, because I think there are some really great resources out there on YouTube, and two, because I'm absolutely terrible at it. So I just finished notching out a channel in the bottom portion of the frame so I can have the 1/2-inch MDF platform sit flush with the frame. And I'm joining these mitered corners on the base frame using dominoes for alignment, glue, and blocking with screws just to hold everything together and keep it all square. And I just want to emphasize that last point, keeping everything square, because this is the base platform that everything is going to be built up from here. So if this is at a square, then everything is going to continue to be at a square as you build up, and it's going to lead to some headaches for sure. So I had to definitely double and triple check all of my corners here. So if it wasn't obvious, this base platform is made of 4 boards in a 4 by 8 rectangle, and then I added 3 stretcher boards attached using glue and pocket holes, and finally I added on that 1/2-inch MDF board I mentioned earlier sitting flush with the frame. I'm using dominoes for alignment here, and this is actually important in this case because the base platform and the legs and the top frame and really all the structural frame pieces that are made out of 2x4 are also going to be the exposed outer faces of this bench. So I just want to make sure that these joints look as seamless as possible. I have 4x4s on the back edge of the bench instead of 2x4s just so I could have a consistent 3.5-inch outward facing legs on all sides. I plan on doing everything in my power to make this bench look as nice as possible, and although I could see a lot of people seeing that as a waste of effort since it's going to get beat up anyway, but I plan on spending a lot of time in here, even more time than with my wife or potential future children. So if I make that selfless sacrifice, I at least want to enjoy the look of my surroundings. So time put into aesthetics is very much time well spent. Alright, but anyway, back to the build here. So I just installed the back and middle legs, and in between those legs I attached the panels made of 3/4-inch plywood using pocket holes and glue. And the panels were all cut using a track saw, so I won't have a lot of repetitive footage showing me cut those out. But the panels are there basically to create the structure of the different sections, so separating out the drawer section from the table saw section while keeping everything enclosed and adding additional structural integrity. So speaking of the drawer section, I had this wild idea of instead of having panels to mount the slides on, I would just mount the slides on these horizontal 2x4s, and that way I could bypass the spacers I would need to mount onto a panel so the slides would be clear of those 2x4 face frames, which hopefully makes some sense. And in theory, it's not the worst idea, but in reality, it's not a great idea. So the reason this wasn't a great idea isn't because I mixed up where these two legs should have been mounted. It's really because it was extremely difficult to keep these slides parallel, square, and all those other requirements you need so that the slides work smoothly without sticking. The panels really do make that process a lot easier, so this is one of those cases where I created a lot more work trying to take a shortcut. And that being said, I will probably try it again just like this to prove that it could work and my ego will be unscathed. So as this video goes on, you'll probably start to see a theme on the joinery, namely pocket holes with glue and dominoes for alignment. And so now that all the legs are up on this right side, I started attaching the top part of the frame using that familiar joinery. And I totally could perform more complex joinery, like no problem, but that'd probably get boring to some of the viewers out there, so I just definitely want to stick to the more interesting kind of joints for this particular bench. And I just continued building the different compartments as per the design using the plywood panels attached to the 2x4 legs, and added on this top frame, which basically is identical to the bottom frame with the exception of the gap where the table saw is going to sit. So when I was coming up with the design, I created a list of non-negotiable features, and everything else that was going to be part of this would just be gravy on top of that. So I landed on 4 essential things: outfeed, assembly space, dust collection, and storage. So starting with outfeed, I figured the best way to maximize the performance was to just have my DEWALT table saw mounted directly into the bench itself, which has its trade-offs. I've been using the DEWALT job site mobile stand, which really has been great, but I really don't plan on moving the table saw around all that much, and the built-in feature would really be nice to make the table saw just more stable and solid. Plus I just made sure that I would be able to lift the table saw out if I ever needed to transport it, which I'll show later. And then as far as the assembly requirement, that basically drove the decision to go with the full 8x4 area, and the outfeed part specifically would be about 6x4, which seemed like more than enough space. And then for the dust collection, I have a Wen dust collector, which I've been using for about 6 months, and it's been working great, and I just needed some way to attach the hose to the dust collection port in the back of the table saw. So those were my 4 essential features, but let me know in the comments what your must-haves are for a workbench. Curious to see what the consensus will be. So the table saw fits in pretty nice, pretty snug. The only thing that I need to do now is notch out some material so that this back side of the fence can move freely. So yeah, in order to create these notches in the top part of the frame, I'm just using my track saw to make a bunch of passes really close together, and then just gonna hog out the rest with a chisel. This is actually one of those cases where I think a circular saw might work even better than a track saw because it's a little more mobile and you can make passes faster. I also need to just make a little shallow notch here to make room for the lever on the table saw that'll release the fence if I ever need to take it off. So for the dust collection, I'm going to have my 2.5-inch port here on the table saw, and then connect it up to my 2.5 to 4-inch reducer piece. And I'm going to have 4-inch tubing through the bench behind these drawers. And I'm going to have a blast gate on this side. So this placement of the dust collection I figured would be the best place, in that it'll be hidden being behind the drawers like this, which is why I left that gap there in the middle. But I can also pull out the drawers and access it if I ever need to clear it or anything like that. So at this point, really the structure of the bench is virtually done, so now I'm just adding in the various features. So after finishing that dust collection, I wanted an access point for power, so I installed this power cord grommet just to give it a cleaner look. So I'm going to be running 2 extension cords from the wall into there, and one will be dedicated to the table saw alone, and the other is going to be going to this recessed power outlet so that I can use for power for hand tools or compressor or whatever else I need it for. And since this cabinet is kind of deep, I figured it might be helpful to have a small light in here just in case I end up having stuff pile up towards the back, less visible area. Alright, so let's talk about vices. So the extent of my knowledge here is that I once saw Joe Pesci use one in the movie Casino, and it wasn't exactly in the woodworking context, so I'm pretty much a beginner. So I did some research here, and it looks like this is another one of those rabbit holes on YouTube. But the two main things I took away in my research is, one, a vise is a very useful tool on any workbench, and two, there's way too much here to try and learn without some trial and error on my own and just getting some real world experience. I'm a firm believer that the best way to get better at something or to gain mastery over something is to actually just start doing it and making your own mistakes and learning along the way. And obviously YouTube and videos like that can help you be better prepared, but overall I don't think there's any shortcut to it, and you actually just have to log those hours. And truthfully, I'm not at a level of craftsmanship where I'd expect to be using a vise all that frequently, but I do know that I want to get started somewhere, so I just landed on this Yoast quick release 9-inch jaw width vise. And seriously though, in this area, I would love to hear in the comments any advice you'd have for the different kinds of vices out there, the best ones to get started with, and what are the best applications for a vise. I don't expect to move this bench that much, but I did add some casters just in case, along with some leveling feet, just to make sure that the top surface will be level. So for all the interior surfaces, instead of staining those, I'm just covering them with this peel and stick wallpaper, just to give it some small added protection and to continue that black look. While this is playing, I'll just give a quick rundown on the material list and the total cost of this bench. So here's a detailed list of all the things I bought for this particular project. Some of them I've already installed and others are going to be later in the video. So overall, it was about $1,400, and I don't know about you guys, but these projects always end up being about twice as much as I initially think they're going to be. I mean, I'm happy to spend the money on something like this that I'm going to be using all the time, but man, it's painful. So for the end of the bench where the table saw is sitting, I wanted to maximize that space on the sides of the table saw as well as the space under the platform where the saw is sitting. So I basically added some dividers to have the lower part be open shelving and the two sections on the sides be pull-out vertical drawers, so that way I can store some of the table saw accessories. And these gaps where the drawers are going to go are pretty awkward. They're deep and skinny, so I built these custom pull-out platform things so I could have access to take things in and out from the sides and the top, just to make it easier to store stuff. And I didn't do anything crazy here, just some 3/4 inch plywood, some pocket holes and glue, and some 1/4 inch plywood for those little walls for the sides of the trays. And I ended up mounting these with a couple of leftover side mount slides that I had, just flipping them horizontal. Not the intended use, but it seemed to get the job done pretty well. So because all the outside faces are construction grade lumber, there were a lot of voids to fill prior to stain and finish. All my joints and everything were perfect, so those didn't need wood filler, but really just the knot holes that required some attention. And no project would be complete without an absorbent amount of time sanding. I believe Anakin Skywalker described it best in episode 2, Attack of the Clones, when he discussed sanding with Padme.
I don't like
sanding.
It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
So as much as I do hate that step, it's actually really important just to make sure that the stain and the finish comes out looking nice. And speaking of staining, I always use this pre-stain wood conditioner just to help the stain soak in more evenly. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I am bordering on an obsession with black stain. And maybe one day I'll grow up to appreciate different colors, but for now this is my go-to. All I'm pretty much doing is flooding the exterior surfaces here, along with a pretty good portion of my floor. My plan for the final look of this will include some contrasting natural wood colors, so stick with me as this thing comes together and you'll start to see a method to my madness. And speaking of contrasting wood, I'm adding the first set of many pieces of trim that will adorn this bench. And all the trim is made out of soft maple, and these are 1x1 strips I'm using to cover the exposed plywood edges of the shelf and the panels for those side compartments there. Nice. So I'm cutting out some more maple trim boards here to trim out the top and bottom frames. And so for these, I'm adding a 25-degree bevel just to make the profile a little more interesting than just a straight board. And some of the pieces here I'll be using for like an edge banding for the top that I'll be attaching last after I get the top on. And then the rest of these I'm going to be tacking onto the lower part of the bench to give it kind of a symmetrical look. Practically speaking, I actually wish I had modified the bench to have a toe kick at the bottom so that I could stand closer to the bench, but I was in too deep trying to add as much trim as possible because of how much I really liked the look of that maple on the black. So after getting most of this trim on, I just continued to cover all the interior cabinet areas with the same black wallpaper. I went a little crazy with this stuff. Throughout this build, I tracked how many hours it took me to complete this thing start to finish, and I didn't include the countless hours of thinking about the design and structure, or the time spent taking multiple trips to Lowe's, often in the same day. But here's a breakdown of the time I put into this thing. So 96 hours of my life just constructing this over the course of 21 separate days. And truthfully, I don't know if that's a good time or egregiously long, but figured I'd share this just in case anybody was interested. So I had some space on the outside of the shelf and drawer area around the table saw, and I could have used this for some kind of pegboard or other productive purpose, but I had a better idea.
Feast your eyes on this!
It's beautiful!
And huge.
Can I touch it?
So those are these really cool aluminum posters made by a company called Displate, and I got a couple made, one of my favorite video game, Hollow Knight, and the other of my favorite show, Futurama. And if you hadn't heard of either of those, then we probably couldn't hang. So next it was time for the arduous undertaking of constructing and installing the drawers, 9 in total. And I'm making the boxes out of 3/4 inch plywood, so I started by ripping down larger panels into strips of 4.5 inches and cutting out the final lengths on the miter saw. And the bottom panels I also made out of 3/4 inch plywood and cut those out using a track saw. So at first glance it may look like I assembled these with pocket holes because I did actually drill out the holes, but I changed my mind later on. I just didn't want to deal with the clamping, so I just ended up using 18 gauge brad nails and glue for the sides and screws to attach the bottom, which felt super solid after the glue dried. I am going with these 20-inch full extension soft close drawer slides, and I would love to say that all of these got installed without issue, so I will. There definitely wasn't any shimming, re-drilling, trimming, or anything like that, thankfully. Oh my goodness. So for the drawer fronts, I'm going to be making these shaker style with maple rails and stiles and 1/4 inch plywood for the panels. And I'm using this rail and style router bit set on my router table. So one bit is used to route out a channel on all the inside edges of the rails and stiles for the panel to sit in. And I use the counterpart bit to route out a tongue on the ends of the 2 rails that'll sit in the grooves of the stiles. I also have this rail cutting sled, which really helps out with the routing of the tongues. Just keeps the board secured tightly as you run it through. Similar process to cut out the panels. I'm just ripping down the strips on the table saw and cutting the cross cuts on my miter saw. I ended up staining the panels black for a couple of reasons. One is to give the drawer fronts a contrast, and 2, because the colors of the maple plywood and the hardwood were actually pretty different, so I thought it would just look better to mask that difference to have them black. Having all these routed tongue and grooves really make the assembly pretty straightforward. All the alignment's taken care of, so all the precision is basically front loaded in the setup of the router table. Just making sure the cuts are made accurately with some trial and error using test pieces. I'm just making sure to add a generous amount of glue where the rails and stiles meet up and clamping everything together. I did have one part of the cabinet where I'm going to have a door, so that's what this piece is here. It's almost the, well, it is the exact same construction of the drawer fronts, just with a bigger panel. So once the glue dried, I just cleaned up any excess squeeze out with a chisel, or at least as much as I could. And then I just did a super shallow pass at the planer right before sanding with some 180 grit. And honestly, at this point, I was getting pretty pumped with how the drawer fronts were starting to look. So right here, I'm adding these little shims or spacers on the back sides of the panels. And these are here so that when I go to attach the hardware, the panels won't flex inwards as I tighten the screws. I'm also just pre-drilling all the holes for the handles that I'm eventually going to be adding to these, and drilling out the cups for the door hinges that I will add to the one door. So for the finish, I'm going to be using gloss spray lacquer. I could probably make a whole video dedicated to this process, but the 10-second version is wipe off all the dust with a tack cloth or something similar. Can't stress that step enough. And then do about 3 to 4 coats, and definitely sand in between the coats with a light sanding sponge. And pro tip, if you're looking for a quick buzz and you don't mind a little brain damage, do the spraying without a mask and in an enclosed space with no ventilation. Alright, so to mount these drawer fronts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stack the 3 in place that I'm going to put in this opening. Alright, roughly a ½ an inch or so gap remaining at the top, so I'm going to fill that up with playing cards. I'm going to count up the cards, divide them up evenly between the 4 gaps that I have in this opening, and use those as my spacers as I get through this. I've already pre-drilled my holes for my hardware. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use those holes to drive in a couple screws and attach it to the drawer box. And then while it's mounted in place, I'm going to drill in some screws inside the box into the drawer front. Then I'm going to remove these that were holding it in place temporarily and finish drilling out the holes and attach the hardware. A few steps, but a good way to mount them consistently. So if you've made it this far in the video, first off, thank you, and I commend you. And just want to say that if you found any part of this video helpful in any way or mildly entertaining, hit the like button. You might have to burn a calorie or two clicking, but it'll be worth it. But in all seriousness, it really helps out the channel. And if you're feeling especially generous, consider clicking the coveted subscribe button. Such a dick. Oh my god, dude. As of posting this, I'm at 461 subscribers, really trying to make that push to 500 subscribers. And believe it or not, I do put in a lot of hours and work into these videos, so really appreciate any support. Okay, into the home stretch, and now time to get to work on the top. And I genuinely think that I'm going to lose a lot of viewers here because the choice I made for the top was a sheet of 1/2 inch MDF with some 3/8 inch laminate flooring on top. I'll let that sink in for a second. Laminate flooring for the top. But stick with me here and I'll do my best to justify my choice. First off, it's cheap. I had this left over from the flooring I put in my house, and I think I used less than 1 box, which costs around 35 bucks. Secondly, all the strength is going to come from that 2x4 frame, and that top surface is basically bulletproof. I mean, this laminate is made to handle non-stop abuse from people walking all over it and dropping stuff on it. And finally, it looks great. I mean, check out that 45-degree grain pattern. I actually have never seen anybody use this for a workbench top before, and probably for good reason. I don't know if it's going to work out, but I'll see how it goes and check back in with my thoughts on a future video. And let me know in the comments if you think I'm crazy, genius, good looking. I'll take any kind of feedback at this point, and I read and respond to all of my comments. So circling back to the trim work here, I'm finally adding that maple trim with the 25-degree bevel as the edge banding. And I ended up staining the top edge of the trim black just to give the whole top a nice black frame. One thing I'd seen in a lot of other workbench videos were dog holes on the work surface. So I personally haven't used them before, but I figured I'd give them a shot with this workbench, and I decided to half commit by only doing half of the work surface. If you rewind just a little bit, I ended up using that metal pegboard I had just as a makeshift jig to mark out the drill holes for the dog holes. I just marked holes 6 inches apart by counting the circles and moved the pegboard as I went along, while leaving half the pegboard aligned to my previous marks to make sure that all the drill holes stayed aligned and spaced consistently. And I used a 3/4 inch spade bit, which drilled out the holes really easily and gave each hole a 3/8 inch round over. Then of course I stained the inside of the holes black, like I do. And pro tip, lacquer thinner really cleans up stain nicely. So if you couldn't tell by now, I use pneumatic nailers constantly, and I never had a good place for my compressor and hose, so I added this retractable air hose spool, which hooks up to my compressor that I'll store in this enclosed cabinet, which I'm super excited about. I had a sliver of space left over on the back side of this bench, so I added a pegboard that I can use to store whatever, and I just added the air guns on here for now. I made the table saw platform slightly low on purpose so that I could come back and add some spacers under the table saw feet so that the table saw surface will sit just slightly higher than the final height of the bench top. So I made these little plywood spacers that the table saw will sit on top of and added those little vertical pieces to prevent the table saw from sliding around. That way I can lift out the saw when I need to move it, but it'll also sit completely secure when it's in the bench. All completed. Spend a minute or two just going through all the different features. I don't have everything fully loaded in here, but for now I've got this drawer for some trash. I'm using this one for my push blocks and push sticks and those kinds of things. It slides pretty nicely. So I just have the switch here for the unnecessary light. It's nice to have the dust extractor in here, that way if I'm doing assembly I can just pop it on. And I have the air compressor and my Fuji sprayer, the tail vise with the compressor hose spool, here's the dust collection, and the power cords just plugged into the wall on this side. So these are the dog holes. So the idea is, yeah, so that tightens it super tight. So this vise, obviously I can clamp stuff like this way, boom. Or I can clamp it this direction, and I'll hold that pretty. That holds a piece in there like that. These casters I can just take out when I'm not using them. You need some serious Andre the Giant strength to actually push this bench up. Just trust me on that. So these drawers I haven't filled just yet. I have plenty of stuff to put in there, but I just want to decide what I want to actually put in here. And then the last thing. Alright, that's going to do it for this extraordinarily long video. Thanks for watching, and if you like the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. We'll see you on the next one.